All right. Welcome to tonight's class, Torah Studies. So, something that's been on my mind, especially because of the current situation over the past several months with COVID, and I'm sure it's been on the mind of many other people, and that is questioning about what is really the meaning of it all? What is the meaning of existence and the bigger picture thing? Do you ever think about how am I ever really going to leave an indelible mark on this world? Am I ever going to really make some kind of discovery that is truly going to change the world? Now, not that we're not all gifted, all unique, different sets of skills and talents that we each have, and something that each and every one of us has that another person does not. Something that each of us can accomplish. Nobody else can. After all, that's why each and every one of us exists. Nobody is redundant. I'm sure amongst our social circles, amongst our friends, our family, people depend on us to the point that I'm sure many people consider us indispensable. But is that enough? Now, this isn't a question that we have all the time because most of the time we're actually distracted. We're distracted with the daily tasks of life, the little things that we do day in, day out, just to keep moving, just to keep afloat. And these are, the daily cycles of life, daily routines that we do until the point that we're repeating them ad nauseum. But once in a while, we get this gnawing feeling. Is that enough? Is there more that we can be doing? And especially at times when we don't have as many distractions, we start to think about it and we feel that gnawing feeling much more. Now, there's something interesting. It's kind of a catch-22. And that is, when we're not accomplishing, obviously we have that gnawing feeling at us, and we have that uncomfortable sense of maybe there's more that I can do. What can I discover? How can I change the world? But then even when we do accomplish things, still we have that question sitting at the bottom of our heart. And that's because if we accomplish something, we say to ourselves, listen, I didn't put that much effort into it. Did I really go all out? Could you imagine? If I would have really gone all out, so that means that my accomplishments are just not that great. They could not have been world-changing or earth-shattering if I didn't have to put that much effort into it. So anytime we're accomplishing, we're kind of back at that question. Anytime we're not accomplishing and we're failing, or we're just not up to the standards we're setting for ourselves. So once again, where do we go with this? How do we bridge that gap between a hopelessly normal life and being exponentially awesome? Or are we supposed to just manage our expectations and be happy and content with what we have and not pursuing that or chasing those dreams? According to Chassidus, to understand this deep, complex, troubling question, we can have some guidance when we look at the concept of a mitzvah, a commandment from God, or more specifically, the power that a mitzvah contains, can give us some enlightenment in this area. Now, in order to explore this and appreciate this, let's go off on a little bit of a tangent, and let's discover something about the first Jew. You see, generally, Avram Avinu is known as the first Jew. The question is, was he really the first Jew? Think about it. When did the Jews first become the Jewish people? And at what point did we go from being Hebrews to Jews? So, conventional wisdom says that when the nation that was enslaved in Egypt, when the exile happened and climaxed with the giving of the Torah at Sinai, that's when we became a nation. That's when we became the Jewish people. Even to the point that the prophet Isaiah says clearly, the birth of the nation was when we left Egypt. But if that's the case, that means to say that our ancestors, our mothers and our fathers, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, were not a part of that experience. They were the forebearers of those who went through that experience. And that would mean that they weren't, quote unquote, Jews. In order to appreciate this concept, it's not the first time the question is being asked. This question has been asked many a time. One of the ways that the commentaries take this concept is as follows. We know that Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our forefather, marries Rachel and Leah, who happen to be sisters. And we know that the Torah forbids a man from marrying two sisters, be it a Jewish man marrying two sisters or a non-Jewish man marrying two sisters. That would be considered incest. That would be considered against the Torah. And if that's the case, how is Yaakov Avinu allowed or able to marry two sisters? There are many different approaches on the subject. One of the approaches is from the Yefei Torah. Yefei Torah, Yafa Torah is Rabbi Shmuel Yafi Ashkenazi from Constantinople, in Turkey, from the early 1500s. And he explores this concept. And he says, how could it be that Yaakov can marry two sisters? Now, this is a question whether he's going to be considered a Jew or a non-Jew, because we know that the non-Jews have the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide laws, which prohibits incest as well. And if that's the case, how can he marry these two sisters? And he explains it must be that our forefathers, Yaakov, was a Jew, and he converted these two sisters. And we know that the Talmud tells us that a convert who converts is kikatan shenoiled dummy. It's as if they were just born to the point that their relatives from before their conversion may no longer have that status of being a relative. And if that's the case, these two sisters are no longer considered halachically sisters, and therefore Yaakov was able to marry them. Now, there wasn't a rabbinic enactment made much later that these two sisters, or the concept of having relatives, is that rabbinically identify them as siblings, as being related in a family sense. But biblically, they are not considered to be related, and therefore there was no problem for Yaakov to marry these two women because he was a Jew. He converted them to Judaism, and like that, biblically, they were not considered siblings. And that seems to solve the issue. Now, others completely disagree with this and say no, that our forefathers were bona fide Noahides, but not just our forefathers, even Moshe Rabbeinu, even Moses. And that this whole concept, as we will explore, that our forefathers kept the Torah, all 613 commandments, and according to the Gemara, even the rabbinic enactments that would later only come about later, that was just an added measure of piety. But there was absolutely no obligation because they were not considered to be Jewish. Now, just some context for this next conversation. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, he grows up in Pharaoh's house. The Jewish people are being enslaved. Long story short, he has to flee the country. He runs to Midian. While in Midian, he meets Zipporah, and he has two children with her, two boys. The youngest boy is born right when Moshe Rabbeinu is told it is time for him to go. He meets God at the burning bush. He has a mission now. He has to go redeem a people. And God tells him, go back to the land, perform the miracles, and you'll free the Jewish people. So he has a little bit of a dilemma. He has a baby that needs to have a circumcision. See, because the mitzvah, the commandment of circumcision was given to the children of Abraham. Already we had in the end of last week's parsha, the beginning of this week's parsha, we have the whole story. And if that's the case, He has to give his son a circumcision. But at the same time, it's dangerous to travel while the child, right after circumcision, the child needs time to heal. And God is telling him, go now. So he has a little bit of a dilemma. Do I circumcise the child or not? And the Talmud tells us, the Medrash tells us, that he made the decision not to circumcise the child. And while they were traveling, miraculously, a snake or a serpent almost consumes, which was really an angel, almost consumes Moshe because he tarried in giving circumcision to his child. Zipporah, his wife, realized what was going on. Quickly, she circumcised their baby, and Moshe's life was spared. So that's just some background for this next little piece. And this is from Rabbi Lisker Mizrahi, otherwise known as the Re'im, an amazing commentary on the Torah and a halachic authority from the mid-1500s, also Constantinople, Turkey. And he says like this: how is it possible that Moshe Rabbeinu can make the calculation that I'm not going to circumcise the child because there might be a danger to travel? You see, this whole idea that we weigh up a positive commandment and that if there's a life danger, we don't do this positive commandment. For example, running a minyan, going to shul, when there are clear issues directly related to COVID. If there's a life or death situation, so we say, v'chai b'hem. You have to live by these commandments because that's what the Torah says, not die by them. And therefore, in certain circumstances, mitzvahs will be suspended for the sake of saving lives. Now, if that's the case, how can Moshe Rabbeinu come up with this idea of maybe I should not circumcise my child, which was a direct command, if the Torah had not been given? If the Torah had not been given, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't have this rule of v'chai b'hem. So where did he get this idea that the v'chai b'hem, that you live by the command, overrides the command to circumcise, which was a clear command given? The v'chai b'hem was not given to Moshe, because from this perspective, Moshe Rabbeinu was not necessarily a Jew until the Jews were taken out of Egypt and converted at the foot of Mount Sinai. And in that approach, Moshe Rabbeinu, as we see clearly from the Re'im of the Mizrahi, he understands that Moshe Rabbeinu was not necessarily going to be considered a Jew. Now, Nachmanides, the great Spanish physician, Talmudist, halachist, Kabbalist, he says clearly, the moment that Avram, our forefather, entered the covenant with God, he became a Jew. And therefore, all of his descendants from that point forward would be considered Jews. What we have from here is just a few different perspectives on the, so to say, Jewish status of those before the leaving of Egypt and before the giving of the Torah. Because we know that the entire nation either converted and became Jews at the foot of Sinai, or were Jews before that. Either way we're going to look at it, it seems to be somewhat inconclusive. And there are arguments and proofs that go this way and that way, backwards and forwards. And the truth, it's nothing new. When it comes to this argument, as is quoted, that already, if you look in the Gemara, you'll find that the Gemara itself is in support of those who claim that Moshe Rabbeinu, that our forefathers, our forebears, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Rachel, they were Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, they were all considered to be Jewish, or like the Medrash says, maybe they were not Jewish, and there's going to be a difference in proofs that will go this way and that way. Now, be that as it may, whether they're going to be considered as Jews or not, the fact is that we're naturally inclined to think of them as full-on Jews. And we're going to take that approach tonight. That from the moment Avram was circumcised, he and his entire household, and subsequently all of their children and offspring from that point forward, were 100% full-fledged Jews. The question begs to be asked then, what did the giving of the Torah, the experience at Sinai, what did it bring to the table? What new ideas did it introduce? Now, you may say it introduced the Torah, it introduced mitzvahs, but in truth, we know, as it says clearly in the Talmud, in Tractate Kiddushin, that our forefathers, our forebears, even before the Torah was given, they kept all of its laws, as we see clearly stated in the verse. Ekev asher shama Avraham b'kodim, being that Avram listened to my voice, v'yishmar mishmarti, he listened to my commandments, mitzvosai, my statutes, ukoisai v'sarasai, and my laws. And if that's the case, what exactly happened at Sinai that changed? What did it bring to the table? They even had yeshivas, as we see. It says in the Gemara that our forefathers went to yeshiva, our forebears went to yeshiva, they never left without a yeshiva. And if that's the case, once again, what did the giving of the Torah actually bring to the table? What did it change? It seems like they had it all. They had Torah, they had mitzvahs. So what did it bring to the table? Now, when it comes to the idea, maybe, how did they even get it? So the Talmud discusses, the Medrash tells us, how would they have had the Torah? One approach is that Adam and Chava had it from Gan Eden, and they gave it to their children. And there was always one person in every generation who had the Torah, even during the times of the wicked people, until that came to Avram, and then it became more widespread after Avram. But there's another fascinating interpretation in the Medrash, and it says no, that their keeping of the Torah and mitzvahs was intuitive. We'll see why that becomes very significant a little bit later on. The idea is that they just knew how to live life. They knew how to be in touch with the true reality and spirituality in the world. That they lived a life of Torah and mitzvahs without it being necessarily transmitted from one generation to the other or being commanded clearly. It was just something that they had a gut feeling about. Now, if that's the case, so it comes out that the difference before Sinai and after Sinai is just about whether we were commanded or not. In other words, before Sinai, when it comes to our forebears, they learned Torah and they did mitzvahs. That was completely voluntary. They came to it at their own goodwill. Versus those of us who came about after Sinai, not necessarily did we come to it on our own. We're being commanded. We're being obligated and mandated that we have to fulfill these 613 mitzvahs. And if that's the case, think about it. Which one is greater? Somebody who is commanded and therefore does it? Or somebody who comes completely voluntary, on their own, and they say, I'm here to do mitzvahs. I'm here to do it. Says the Gemara, greater is the one who is commanded to do a mitzvah and performs it than one who is not commanded to do a mitzvah and performs it, which would mean that greater is the person who came along after we were commanded and mandated at Sinai to fulfill 613 mitzvahs than somebody, referring to our forebears, who kept the entirety of Torah and mitzvahs before it was given, because they were doing it out of their own good will. Now, if you think about it, it seems counterintuitive. How is it possible that those who are doing it out of their own free will, their own goodwill, that they're completely voluntary when it comes to doing the Torah and mitzvahs? How is that not greater than those of us who do it because we have to? We're told that this is what the covenant that we came into at Sinai. We're being mandated to do these 613 mitzvahs. Seemingly, those who weren't commanded are a lot better and a lot more refined. And if you think about it, just from a perspective of a parent, when you have the child who you ask them to do their particular chore, and then they actually do it, which that in itself is a novelty. But then you have the child who you wake up in the morning and they're already dressed on their own. You didn't have to get into a fight with them or ask them to get dressed. They got dressed on their own. Or you don't have to ask them to make their bed. They made their bed on their own. Why? Because they felt like it. They felt like it was the right thing to do, or they decided to help clean up after dinner. You think intuitively that it's the child who did it completely on their own volition, that has a lot more of a value than the one that you have to ask every single time. One that is only doing it because you're saying, please do this or please do that. And if that's the case, think about our forebears. They lived in a depraved society, lived amongst great immorality. And nevertheless, they led virtuous lives despite all odds, staying morally afloat. Is that not more virtuous than somebody who's going to come along and fulfill a mitzvah, a commandment that's mandated after Sinai? In order to appreciate this, we have to understand the general concept of what does it mean that they kept all the mitzvahs and they studied in yeshiva. Now, so we explained before of how they might have had that tradition, either intuitively or as a tradition passed down. But what does it mean that they did the mitzvahs? And let's just see this in the wording of the fifth Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Dober Schneerson. And he writes as follows: how can you say that they wore tefillin? We know that in the tefillin, right, in the black boxes, there are parchments. All these parchments are written. You have different portions of the Torah that discuss the leaving of Egypt, the exodus of Egypt. And if that's the case, if the exodus never occurred, how can you have tefillin with parchments inside? Okay, another example. When it comes to sitting in a sukkah, why do we sit in a sukkah? Because we left Egypt. Egypt didn't happen yet. Another great mitzvah is eating matzahs. We know that they ate matzahs. We have that in this week's parsha when Avram, where he serves the angels. And then later when they go to Lot's house, and once again they have matzahs at Lot's house. But how can they have matzahs? Egypt never happened yet. They never left Egypt yet. So what kind of mitzvahs are these? So you must say that the whole idea of them fulfilling mitzvahs was not physical. It had nothing to do with the physical expression of the mitzvah. Rather, it was the concept of what the mitzvah represents. What does matzah represent? Matzah represents freedom and humility. And it was about them getting in touch and in tune with what freedom and humility truly means. What is tefillin? Tefillin is about giving over one's mind and one's heart to God, and not allowing the heart to run free, and that the mind should remain in control of the impulses of the heart. And that's what they were getting in touch with. So were they necessarily doing the mitzvahs in a physical way? Not necessarily. They were tapping into a spiritual reality of what the mitzvah represented. And that was something, of course, you can do without having these special parchments inside a pair of tefillin. And that's something you can have whether the Exodus happened or not, and whether the matzah was the same type of matzah or not is irrelevant, because it's about getting in touch with the spirituality of what that mitzvah is. You see, they didn't need to gaze into the future and glean information on how to create Judaica, because they didn't need Judaica to fulfill the mitzvah. It wasn't about the physical item of the mitzvah being used. It was rather about the intentions and the spiritual experience behind the mitzvah. Now, we see this in a fascinating story that we're going to read about in a few weeks about Yaakov, when he's the shepherd of his father-in-law's sheep and his own flock. And what he would do with these sticks, he used to take these different parts of a tree, trunks of a tree, whether it was hazelnut or chestnut, and some of them he would make streaks in them, stripes in them, dots in them. He would do something with them, then he would put them into the troughs where the animals would drink from. They would see these. They would get very heated when they saw them. And then when the animals would procreate, some would come out ringed, Some would come out spotted, and some would come out striped. Very interesting, very fascinating, very vague as to what was actually happening. So the Zohar gives us a little bit of an insight. And the Zohar says, what took place was Yaakov was using these sticks to put on tefillin. Now, does that mean he was wrapping around his arm like black boxes and leather straps? Absolutely not. What it meant was he was causing the unity that happens through the tefillin. He was able to accomplish that by means of these tree trunks and putting them together. And the moment he was done with it, there was absolutely no holiness and beauty into these pieces of wood, and he was able to just chuck them out. That's the idea that the mitzvahs before the giving of the Torah were not physical. They represented a spiritual idea. Give me an example from the beginning of this week's Torah portion, actually. We find that Avram is in the middle of talking to God, face to face. Avram is recovering from his circumcision, and God visits him. All of a sudden, Avram notices 3 strangers. He thinks that they are travelers, and in truth, they're just angels. Avram says, God, hold on, I have people to take care of. And he goes running and he brings them in, and we know he brings them some exquisite tongue and other things to eat and drink and relax. He's a great host. Now, the interesting thing over here is the Torah does command us to be a kind host to people. But there's no command in the Torah. And the mitzvah is called hachnasas archim, having guests. But the Torah doesn't command us anywhere to host angels. And if that's the case, can we really say Avram did the mitzvah of hosting these angels? They made it look like they ate. They didn't actually eat. And angels don't need to be hosted. So how can you say he went ahead to do a mitzvah to the point that he put God on hold for it? And the truth is, look at the mitzvah from a little bit of a different perspective. You see, when we focus on a mitzvah, for example, the mitzvah of hosting guests, where's the focus? On the person. I am hosting someone, I am doing someone good. I am doing someone a favor. I am helping someone out. Whether they need it or not is irrelevant. However, before the Torah was given, it wasn't about what you did. It was rather about how you did the mitzvah, which meant, what's the whole idea of being kind to someone? It's expressing a certain trait that you have embedded within you and expressing your kindness by giving to them. See, Avram was able to express his kindness. The fact that there was no real recipient over here because they were just angels, that aspect is irrelevant to mitzvahs before the giving of the Torah. Because before the giving of the Torah, the whole idea of a mitzvah was the spiritual experience that the person went through in doing the mitzvah. It wasn't about the physical item that was changed or affected in any way, shape, or form. It was about the fact that my attribute of kindness was now expressed in an amazing way and therefore connects me to God, to a certain extent at least. However, when it comes to the mitzvahs, post Sinai, it's not about necessarily a spiritual experience that you go through, which is very important and very nice if you get to experience it, but is not the focus of the mitzvah after Sinai. It's about, did you accomplish it or not? So Yaakov was able to use sticks for his tefillin because he was able to accomplish the unity of God and giving over the heart and the mind should control the impulses of the heart through sticks, because the fact that there was no boxes there was irrelevant. However, after Sinai, if the boxes are not square, if the boxes are lacking the parchment, there's absolutely no mitzvah being done, no matter what kind of intentions you're going through in your mind, what kind of spiritual experience you're having. If the physical aspect of the mitzvah is lacking, it's not a mitzvah. And the same thing is in the reverse. The Talmud says that if somebody drops a $5 note from their pocket and they don't even realize that they dropped it, and a poor person or a person who needs that money comes along and picks it up and finds it, and the person now keeps it, you've accomplished the mitzvah of tzedakah. even though you completely did not go through the emotional experience or the spiritual experience of giving tzedakah. Why? Because you've changed the world. You've done something kind to somebody else. The recipient received it. The physical item, the entity changed. And therefore, even if a person puts on tefillin, it's best if they know what they're doing and they're going to understand what they're going to accomplish. But even if you accomplish it without, you put on the tefillin or you light the Shabbos candles, even without thinking deeply into the spiritual experience of what happens when you light Shabbos candles, how you brighten up the world and you changing the world. Nevertheless, the mitzvah is done. And that is the general difference between the mitzvahs before Sinai and after Sinai. Right? What do we see? Yaakov, what did he do with his tefillin sticks? He threw them in the trough when he was done, which meant that there was absolutely no value to them or holiness with them once he is finished. The contrary is, we have clear laws in the Jewish code of law. It says, when you have a container of a Torah scroll, a mezuzah case, tefillin straps, a box that a Torah was once in it, a chair upon which you read the Torah scroll, or the curtain that hangs in front of the ark, known as the forefathers, these all need to be treated special. Even after you are done using them, you can't just discard them or disgrace them. They have to be treated with respect and holiness, because once you use it even one time for a mitzvah, it becomes holy forever. And that's because you've changed the item. Where do we get the power to change such a thing? That is something we have yet to explore. Now, let's just understand this a little bit. See, what's the logic that the mitzvahs that are done by us, because we were commanded, why would that change the object? To all of a sudden become something holy. Until now it was mundane, and now all of a sudden it's holy. Seemingly, the approach that our forebears had, that it wasn't about the physical experience, it was completely about the spiritual experience. And it was completely about the idea of using physicality as a stepping stone to reach a spiritual place. That seems to align much more with what a mitzvah is all about, the holiness and spirituality of it. And if that's the case, how is it possible to say that we have a stronger and a greater influence than that of our forebears, that their influence, so to say, left the world much earlier than ours? Because when we do it, it's an everlasting influence, versus when they would do it, the moment they were done with the mitzvah, the influence was gone. What advantage was it that they actually had? That we actually had, sorry. The idea is like this. Our forebears, as accomplished as they were, and as spiritual as they were, and great, that everything they did was about reaching the max, the peak of human capacity. And that's why what was so special is the fact that they were intuitively aware of what Hashem wanted even before the Torah was given. They didn't need the Torah to be given for them to know what it was that God wanted, because they were in touch with God. They were in touch with the truth of reality, and therefore automatically and intuitively knew what to do and what not to do. However, our mitzvahs are greater. Why? As the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy, the great rabbi of Prague in the 1500s, explains as follows. If you think about it, what was the motivation behind all the mitzvahs that Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, our forebears, all the mitzvahs that they did were motivated by the human being, by being the greatest person you can be. That was the motivation behind all of their behavior. However, those of us who are commanded post-Sinai, the motivation behind our mitzvah is 100% something much greater than any human being, and that is, our motivation is because we are commanded, and therefore a godly motivation. If you think about it like this, everything they were doing, as great as it was because they were able to tap into the greatness of a human being, the greatest a human being can accomplish. However, that left them stuck, not being able to transform the world because spirituality and physicality have nothing to do with each other. They're two opposite worlds. And that's why they were never able to bring that spirituality and infuse this physical world because they were stuck with human limitations. However, when it comes to us, when we perform a mitzvah, why do we do it? Because God mandates it. And therefore, we are working with the power and the influence of true infinity. And to God, spirituality and physicality are no different. God is equally infinite beyond both of them. And therefore, we are able to infuse physicality with spirituality because we are not working with human limitations, rather with godly lack of limitations. In the words of the Rebbe says that Avraham Avinu was able to accomplish the most a human being can accomplish by being in touch with Hashem, right, and being in touch with the godly reality to the greatest extent. But as we know, ultimately, when it comes to doing mitzvahs and learning Torah, the goal is not spirituality. Spirituality is not a goal and an end for itself. Rather, spirituality is sometimes a part of doing a mitzvah. Why? What makes it so special? Because it's God's will. And ultimately, as long as we're not acting with God's will, as it was when it came to our forefathers and our foremothers, because ultimately everything that they did, all the goodness that they did, was motivated by them and their being intuitive and in touch with the truth of reality, but it wasn't, the driving factor was not God's will. However, when it comes to us post-Sinai, everything we do is God's will, and therefore we're able to fuse these two worlds, these two realities of spirituality and physicality to come together as one. Now, does this mean that the mitzvahs that we do today are completely foreign to the way that the mitzvahs of our forefathers and our foremothers? And the truth is not, because there was one mitzvah that they did have that resembled this idea. And that was the mitzvah of the bris milah, which we discussed last week. And that was the one mitzvah that was actually given to them. You see, what we celebrate, what happened at Sinai, is that the Torah was given to us, meaning the power of God, the power to connect with God on an infinite level was given to us at Sinai. That was also given to our ancestors before Sinai in this particular mitzvah. And like this, they were able to pave the way for us to help us. Now, what do I mean? How do they help us? And the idea is like this. That the mitzvahs that we have the ability to completely transform the world around us, change the world, make it a more godly place, make the meaningless meaningful, make the mundane sanctified and holy. But what about when I don't feel this empowerment? What about when I don't understand how this mitzvah changes or makes a difference? What about when I'm confused and I'm lost and I lack motivation? Where do I go from there? From there, we look at Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, and we see what they were able to accomplish. They were able to take the human being and take the human being to the next level, to the greatest point that a human being can come to on their own. Avram, before he receives the first mitzvah, he's 99 years old when he gets the first mitzvah. But his entire life, he did not stop moving. He did not stop growing. He had that thirst and that hunger that all human beings have and feel, as we discussed in the beginning of class, that question of what can I do? What can I accomplish? How can I change this world? He had that hunger, he had that thirst, and he pursued it to the most that a human being could pursue it. And that's supposed to motivate us, because when we look back at them, we can see what they've gone through, the trials and tribulations, what they had to stand up to. And that should motivate us to want to push forward, learn more, understand more. However, that's all still within the human spectrum of things. On the other hand, we have to know that as much as we try, and as much as we push, and as much as we struggle in the human arena, ultimately, it's about what Hashem puts at the end, what Hashem brings to the table at the end. Avram, through all of his hard work, 99 years, pursuing it, what makes it the greatest is that after 99 years of giving it everything he has, bringing the human being to the greatest heights of the human being, all of a sudden Hashem gives him that mitzvah. And that's what we have. And that's what we can take away. So if you think about it like this, it's about giving it everything that you have. And that means even doing the simple mundane tasks of daily life and just being there, just showing up, doing what is mandated of us. And Hashem does the rest. Where does the magic happen? Where does the great world changing things and ideas, discoveries? These happen when we do everything that is dependent on us, everything that was mandated from us. And then Hashem gives us the finishing touches. Hashem is what makes it truly infinite. And that's the idea of what a mitzvah is all about. So, can we bridge the gap of the hopelessly ordinary life to exponentially awesome? Yes. Do the most you can. Reach the edge of your hopeless normalness. And that's where the magic happens. That's where Hashem has to do his part and reach out to finish it up.